on Course Report, which is a resource for choosing the best coding bootcamp for you. If you haven't used Course Report yet, I promise this is my one shameless plug. We have 20,000 alumni reviews, Q&As with alumni and bootcamp instructors, research, and videos like this one. So today I am so happy to be joined by John Holman, who took the immersive bootcamp at LearningFuze in California. So thanks so much for being here, John.
Thanks so much for having me, Liz.
Yay. Recently we've been asking alumni from different boot camps to share the final projects that they actually built during their boot camp. I think this can be a really nice way to see just how much you can actually learn and how far a boot camp can get you. So John graduated from LearningFuze about a year ago, and he's now a software engineer, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But before we get to that, I've got a lot of questions about that project that he worked on at LearningFuze, and John is going to walk us through it. So John, before we actually dive into your project, I'm curious what you were doing before LearningFuze. What's your kind of pre-bootcamp story?
Yeah. So before LearningFuze, I was working as a project manager. I worked at advertising agencies, mobile game companies, and even ad tech companies. Just trying to get projects from start to finish. I actually had touched what I thought was a lot of code before going to a boot camp. XML, HTML, CSS, and then copy pasting from Stack Overflow, for JavaScript and things like that. So nothing, I didn't really know what was going on, but I at least was familiar with a lot of different things. And then from there, I had a lot of different jobs over a very short period of time, and noticed that the engineers were kind of the last ones to be in a company or more, I guess, valued in terms of their contribution, because a lot of the things that we were doing were very high tech. So that with the little code that I had touched, as well as some other small things that I was doing online, I really wanted to focus on that and wanted to delve into that a little bit more so that I could start to kind of build the different things that I wanted to build that I just didn't have the understanding for.
So then when you decided to kind of look for a boot camp, was your goal in going to a coding boot camp to actually change your career, or was it initially just to add on a new skill set? What was your kind of overall goal?
The overall goal was to change my career. With project management and sort of the companies that I was with, a big motivator going from what I was doing to software engineering was salary. So project managers didn't make as much in the arenas that I was in, but engineers have the potential to make more money and grow and have more responsibility. Whereas a project manager, you kind of have that same stuff, but then there's always a point where you just kind of stop and you have to either become like a COO or there isn't really that much growth and then that final jump.
That makes total sense. And is a very sophisticated way of looking at your kind of career path. So that's really smart. So did you research any other coding boot camps, or did you have your heart kind of set on LearningFuze from the beginning? Tell us about your research process and why you chose LearningFuze.
Yeah, with a lot of things, actually, even in my family, I'm known as the person to go to they're going to research every option and then, pick one that at least is right for me. So with the boot camps, I was looking at a lot of different ones, and then I had a friend who had gone to LearningFuze and had told me about LearningFuze. And so that was sort of one of the last ones on the list. And I went to information session and had a conversation with the people who were not only students there, but the alumni, as well as instructors, and got just a good sense from just being there and being around those people. One of the things that actually attracted me to them was the fact that they didn't say they had 100% placement rate, that they were a little bit more in the like 94 range, or 90 range, that um, you know they didn't say everybody was placed, which gave a little bit of, like, I guess, that sort of humanness to it. So after the information session, after having sort of all of the information that I could get from LearningFuze, coupled with all the other information I'd gotten from other boot camps, I decided the in-person immersive was the way to go. And then I really liked LearningFuze because the alumni that I had talked to were still continuing to get support from LearningFuze, even though they were already working, 6-8 months into their new careers. And so having the ability to always kind of come back and have information, because I mean, no one has all the answers, right? So
For
going
sure.
back and being able to actually ask instructors and others who have seen the various technologies that you've been working with was really, really helpful, and really like a huge selling point for me.
I think you gave 3 really good pieces of advice in your answer, which is to actually go to the classroom, go to an info session, talk to alumni, and then also ask about placement rates.
Yeah.
So when people ask me like how to research a boot camp, like those are my those are 3 of my pieces of advice. So that's fantastic. I love that you asked about job placement. It's really smart. So then once you got to LearningFuze, could you tell us just about a typical day? What was the actual learning experience like? And did it kind of work for your learning style?
To answer the second part of that, is it really did work for my learning style. We dove right in. So before you start, you kind of take, it's called Root Level 1 and Root JS. It's just to give you that really high brief overview of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, because that's the core of what you're going to be working with. And then once you kind of go through that, you take an assessment just to make sure that you're kind of able to at least understand the concepts, right, that have been taught. From there, then I started sort of relearning the stuff that we did in the root HTML or the JavaScript class, because the big thing was, okay, we kind of went over that. Now we're going to come back. We're going to refresh on it as the basis for kind of everything that we're doing moving forward. And then a typical day was us coming in. We would then have some solo time, just kind of trying to bring up our projects and work on various things that we were doing. We would have assessments. So after the lectures that we would have, about once or twice a week, we would then have these about 10-20 question assessments that would just sort of like solidify, like, oh, do I know what a variable is, or do I know what the proper syntax is, and different things like that, so that we're continually sort of looking at code, looking at others' code, so that we kind of understand that maybe this one doesn't have a closing tag, so that's not going to render on the page, or whatever else it could be, as we're kind of learning sort of the basics of that. And you kind of continue that process, and then as you get further down the line, the assessments are kind of replaced with hackathon projects, or the final project that we're going to discuss later.
That's great. So at some point you stop getting like 20 question assessments, and it becomes like what you can actually build.
Right.
That's really neat. At what point, like halfway through, they became projects?
So in the 12-week course, it was week 4.
Okay, cool.
That we did a hackathon, our first hackathon, and then week 6, we did our second hackathon, and then from about week 9 until 12, you're working on your final project, like a lot.
That's awesome. Okay, I want to get to your final project in 1 second, but could you tell us a little bit about your instructors
Yeah.
during the class? Like who were they? How many instructors did you have?
Yeah. So we had, I'd say it's probably 8 instructors total. So in the first 6 weeks, you kind of have I mean, you're even sitting on one side of the building, right? You're learning all the basic stuff. You're with some of the more junior instructors. Not to say that they don't know what they're talking about, but they haven't been there as long as the others. Um, and then we had one senior instructor there as well. So his name is Dan, and he knows everything. I mean, he was like our resource, right? If we were stuck on anything, we could go to him, whether that be during class or even after class, or even Slack on at like 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes he was still up.
That's cool.
So he was a great resource. And then he would walk us through more of the JavaScript and more of the intense, for us back at that time, that intense stuff, where some of the junior instructors would do the HTML, CSS. We'd learn about bubbling and other concepts, just more of those core basic concepts. Then when we we were seniors, so we were just there longer. We had a couple more instructors who were focused solely on like React. That was how we built our final projects, and that's sort of what we learned because that's what's being used most widely in the world. And so we wanted to make sure that we had 2 instructors at least that were able to kind of talk to us about React components and how like that sort of workflow works within React.
Cool. That sounds
And
like
then,
nice support.
yeah. And then there was actually one other instructor, and it was
Mm-hmm.
all about, let's work on your LinkedIn profile. Let's work on your
Mm-hmm.
networking. Let's work on this other aspect, right? Because, okay, that's great that you know this stuff now, at least at a particular level, but you also have to be able to market yourself and put yourself out there to be able to actually get a job.
For sure. Okay, so could you share your screen and
Sure.
show us your final project that you built?
Yeah. Let's see.
Okay,
So
cool. Yeah, tell us about it.
so this was my concept. This was part of the reason I actually went into the boot camp, right? I had this idea and I didn't know how to build it myself, and I didn't know who to even talk to start building it. And then what we did at LearningFuze is we had a couple pitch sessions where we pitched the ideas that we had to the rest of the class, and then it was narrowed down, and then there were a few projects that were picked, and then teams were put onto those particular projects. So mine was it's a film funding tool
Mm-hmm.
that you put in your information, and then we would give you financial projections um, based on kind of what your idea is, to see how marketable it is and how sellable it is to a distribution company or something like that. So
Cool.
um,
Did you work in the film industry before
I did
you
a
did
little
Learning
bit.
Fuse?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's kind of like, I used to do all this stuff in Excel, and that was terrible. I wanted a way to,
Right.
kind of automate it and make it a little bit more about getting information and then being able to return, um, the various outputs that we needed
Right.
in a more, I mean, to be honest, beautiful way. There's only so far an Excel spreadsheet can, excite someone. So
For
I
sure.
wanted to kind of take that and visualize it a little bit more. So
So this could be used by like potentially by a film investor, or it could be used by somebody making a film who is trying to attract investors and can show them like
yeah,
an elegant way to see how much money the movie could possibly make.
right. So
Cool.
I worked with a producer for a little while in creating these Excel spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
And so you as a producer could come and kind of put in your information and see how marketable it is, or you as a financier could see how maybe, three separate projects, you're able to use those three separate projects to sort of bundle them together to kind of hedge your bets on those three films that at least one of them would be able to make a return.
Very inside movies. I feel like this is a very appropriate California
Yeah.
funnel project. I love it.
Right.
Okay, so you mentioned that you did this, you pitched it, and then uh, LearningFuze kind of formed into groups, your cohort did, and then you worked on this as a group?
Yeah. So there are, depending on the group, there were four groups that had about 4 or 5 people in them, and then there were actually 2 people who did solo projects because that's always an option. So you got to pick how you were going to do your back end. The front end was going to be done in React, and they gave the option of Node or PHP, and my group was the only group that chose to go with a PHP backend and not a Node backend. So we actually had to learn PHP outside of the class. Myself and one other developer, we ended up being the backend developers. And because a lot of math was involved and everything, I kind of took the lead on that. And then we had both of us learning PHP and trying to get even more information. So
How was it to learn PHP in like a week?
yeah, and like it was like 2 days we had to at least get up and running with our server. So it wasn't too bad. I feel like we've kind of stepped through it a little bit. So that same instructor Dan, he has been writing PHP for a while, and so we were able to kind of go to him with questions that we had. I mean, every day we learned something new, from creating sessions for people, for a particular person that was logged into the server. That was like day probably like 10 of 20 that we finally learned that. So it's like, oh wow, that opened up like a whole nother realm.
Right. So you split the group into a React front end. A couple of people worked on the front end in
Yep.
React, and then you and another person worked on the back end in PHP. And then how did you did you connect to like APIs to get to actually pull the data in, or did you build that database yourself?
So yes and yes. What we did is we found a few APIs um, that would be able to give us a lot of the information that we needed. Um, for our particular purposes, there's one called the movie database, not IMDb, but TMDB, because IMDb actually doesn't have an API. So we'd have to
Interesting.
either web scrape, which we didn't want to do, or just call out to an API from this other company. And it was able to provide box office information, all these, even these pretty little pictures. We went out to the API. We even got these images that are in the background here from that particular API. They have posters, marketing materials. I mean, they kind of did all the work, and we just were able to grab it and beautify it, or beautify our site by using their assets. So that was one
Okay.
great one. And then even Wikipedia, we tried to use the Wikipedia API to be able to grab some information about production companies and things like that maybe the other API did not have.
So, okay, so could you take us through the features of the actual project?
Yeah. So I think everyone's first impulse is to create, the login page, right? Let's make it so that users can log in and all that kind of thing. But that's super difficult. So we went through building out all the other features, and then if we had time, we came back and we actually created a login portion for that. So if you were to come, you can just try out by putting in, this would be like your project, right? So let's say you're doing like the Fresh Prince movie. You would put your movie title in. It'd probably run about 90 minutes. And then you have a log line or like a selling um, in for like aliens that's in space, no one can hear you scream. So it's kind of like that quick, short, catchy sort of marketing title. So you could do like
Back in Bel Air. Oh,
yeah, like
yeah,
this is a
nice.
story all about how, and then your synopsis is what's going on. So it'd be like a man who gets from West Philadelphia who gets sent to
Yeah.
LA because he got in a fight playing basketball. So you could put like um, moves to Bel Air and becomes a fresh prince. So then here, right, you're telling us what are sort of the actual information that we might be able to go and grab comparable films for. So I think the movie would be released in 2021. It's going to be a comedy. Definitely is going to be PG-13. I mean, we're not going to try to make an R-rated film for Fresh Prince fans. And then you select at what stage you are actually in. So we would be pre-production. And then we decided that because people say like a film is usually this meets that. So it's like, um, you know, Star Wars is like Flash Gordon meets 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? So when you actually start typing in, let's do so like the Secret Life of Pets, we were able to actually use, if I could spell, we were able to use that same API to start grabbing films because with the APIs that we were using, it needed to be very specific. So if I typed in Kingsman without the colon, that's a completely different thing than Kingsman: The Secret Service, and it would return errors. So we decided to kind of do this autofill so that you could select a particular film. Um, so this one, I guess if we're doing the Fresh Prince one, it would be like Bad Boys meets like Trading Places. I know a lot of films, so there's also another thing of like why it excited me. So then what we would do is we would take that information and we'd create comparables, much like when you're buying a house. They look at the homes that have sold recently in your area. It's that same kind of concept where you're using what has happened in the past to help kind of project what could happen for your film in the future.
And so you used PHP on the back end to kind of build out that weighting system and that model.
Right. Yeah. So
Cool.
our API would call our database. If we didn't have the film, we'd actually go out and we'd look at um, where to grab that film, grab the information, and then we'd actually populate our own database with that, so that if that film was ever used again, it's a much faster call as opposed to going out again to another API and sort of exhausting those API calls that you can do in a their given amount of time.
Cool. Could you tell us about like a roadblock or a challenge that you ran into when you were building this project? I mean, you learned PHP in a couple of days.
Yeah,
That seems
that
like a
that's a
challenge.
roadblock.
But yeah, I'm just curious, like if y'all, you were working with 4 people on this, on a front end and a back end, like I imagine that some things you could face some challenges. Like, how did you get over those since you only had a couple weeks to really do the project?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say kind of one of the big ones is time, right? We had such a limited amount of time to build it. and to make it function. Um, and so for people with their varying schedules and all those kinds of things, it makes it hard sometimes to actually line up outside of our lectures and outside of class to be able to continue working on our project, and get it to a point where we're super happy with it. The other part of that, I actually would say, is it's going to give you that real world experience. So um, you're going to be working with other people who have various personalities. So it's more about, and this is kind of where my project management actually helped, was bringing all that back to, okay, well, this is the goal that we have. Let's set some milestones in between, so that we know we're kind of on track. If we're having issues with a particular technology, let's bring that up quickly so that we can resolve it. Let's go find someone who can help us out if we can't do it ourselves. So one of the good things that came from me being in this group, was that project management background helped me sort of set up and get everybody on board. I didn't want it to be a dictatorship, but get everybody on board to be able to walk through how we're going to actually execute on everything, because we found that a lot of the other groups were struggling even just getting it off the ground, whereas we were able to sort of set time limits and check-in points to be able to really sort of hone that process. With all that said, though, I mean, the greatest plans are thwarted in 5 minutes, right? So there were times where we on the back end were running into a roadblock and we're like, okay, no, just 5 more minutes or just 10 more minutes or just another hour and we'll figure it out. But we had to really, really stop ourselves and say, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know the answers. Let's go, find someone and sort of get over ourselves, to be able to go ask for the help, because it's sitting there the entire time. You just have to tap into it.
That's really insightful. And I also love that you could like see how your previous background is now useful
Yeah.
in the technical world. I think a lot of times we can think that, especially if you're making a career change, that oh, you want to hide your past
Right.
career path
Yeah.
and just pretend like you've only ever been in tech, but actually the kind of intersection of those two careers is what makes you a like special addition to a team. So that's
Right.
really cool.
I mean, I would say for anyone who's looking at a boot camp, right, bring all that with you, because that's only going to help. I mean, we had mathematicians, we had real estate people, we had a lot of different people from varying backgrounds, and all that knowledge that you've gained isn't useless, or isn't, you don't throw it away. That's the stuff that you can actually really use to push projects forward and to push anything else forward. So use that.
That is very smart. So then this was almost a year ago, right? You've
Yeah.
actually been, you actually graduated and have been working in the real world. So I don't want to not get to talk about that.
Yeah.
Were you able to add this project to your portfolio, and like, did it help in the job search? How did you kind of position it to spin it
Yeah.
into a job?
um I definitely, it's in my portfolio. One of the big things actually was getting a few projects that helped me look at where I wanted to go as well. And so I had initially started looking at particular companies. So I looked at like NBC, and I looked at a lot of like entertainment type companies. And this would be a project that would really showcase that. And then from there, I sort of widened my net as well. Like, okay, now it's companies in geographical regions, or companies that just have a job posting. You sort of start with that narrow vision, and then you just kind of keep letting it open up and open up, so that you're really trying to, um, utilize what you've learned in your boot camp to really go after and find a job. Um, you know, People use React. There's so many jobs for React.
Yeah,
Another reason we chose PHP was because there are a lot of back-end jobs in the area that use PHP, and so it was all building ourselves as selling points to build up our resumes, to be able to say, hey, I don't have a whole lot of experience, but I do have some experience, and here's something that I built using this technology, not just like reading documentation online.
for sure. Okay, and now you are a software engineer at Gritty.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
can you tell us about your job, what you're doing, and what Gritty is?
Yeah. So Gritty is a wholesale electricity provider, for those in
I
Texas.
get it. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a little punny. Um, and so what happens is, we're sort of cutting out all the middlemen, and we're allowing people to have that exact wholesale price, right? And then where I fit in that is I am a part of the growth team, or pod. And what we do is we're looking at the enrollment flow and just trying to tweak it and modify it to, make sure that the people that we get in the top of the funnel make it all the way to the bottom, and actually sign up as members. So I work in React day in and day out, and we use Redux and, even Redux sagas. So there are even things that I had no idea about, right? That I'm now digging into and trying to learn more about and understand. And so I actually wrote, um, an experimentation sort of framework so that we could, have people come in, they get put into a controller, a variant, and then we're able to send them down various paths to get, information about usage and, conversion rates and things like that, so that we can keep pushing, um, for higher engagement and more retention in terms of our users.
And how did you actually get the job? You mentioned working with like a career coach or with that
Yeah.
instructor at LearningFuze who was working on like LinkedIn and your resume and stuff. But did you end up getting the job through like a connection with LearningFuze, or was it just
No.
submitting as many applications as possible?
Yeah. So, I think I was unique, in the sense that I started looking for a job while we were doing our final projects, knowing that it takes a while to get a job. Um, so I had started applying for jobs, during the program. I started to look at, okay, where am I willing to travel? I live outside of LA, but I know that there's Silicon Beach, right? So there's a lot of tech companies in that area. So I started focusing on that, focusing on other local, companies, and sort of started there. Learning Fuse has a lot of connections in the area, in Orange County, and so, I didn't want to. Um, I didn't want to like put a resume out there, put a portfolio out there, and then, have someone see it and it gets back to Learning Fuse before sort of I was done with the program and things like that. So, I started looking out in the LA area, and then I just started applying. So on LinkedIn, there's a easy apply, and I can be a poster child for that. It was an easy apply, so I sent in my resume. They got back to me. What was very unique though was because, and this is kind of going back to don't throw the knowledge that you have away, from beforehand. I had worked in so many various technologies that they were using and that they were specifically looking for. So Google Tag Manager, Google Analytics, um, Hotjar, which is a video recording of or how people interact with a web page. So, um, I could easily come in as a marketing sort of engineer, and be able to, you know, have much less time, in sort of that ramp up phase. So, bringing all that knowledge with me was ultimately what ended up, landing me the job. It took about 4 weeks though from the initial application that I had sent in to hearing from them,
Hmm.
having those dialogues, then a phone, then on site, and then, finally offer and all that kind of stuff. So, by no means is it something that took less time for me, but knowing how long that process takes, I wanted to start early because, you know, the goal is to get a job when going through the boot camp. So,
For sure.
um, you know,
Well, yeah, and we were talking about the kind of intersection of your past life and your future life, and that seems so perfect. Like you had
yeah,
that background in growth marketing, and
right,
now you
right.
work on a growth team, but in an engineering with an engineering background. So that is such a cool story.
Yeah.
Did learning, so you really like tried to kind of approach the job hunt on your own before the class was over, but does that mean that you didn't like work with that career coach and that they weren't really
No,
involved with your job hunt?
I mean, they were very involved.
Mm,
I would send my LinkedIn profile, resume. We would do whiteboard mock interviews, regular, just sort of personable mock interviews as well, because it's all those things combined. It's not just one thing, or now that you understand how to code, like that's all you need to rely on. You need all those different things, right? No one's going to want to work with you if they don't get along with you, or no one is going to hire you for a position if you don't know the skill set that they need. So it's very much hand in hand. So I worked with him and would send him, I think he saw like 15 drafts of my resume, and it was constantly being updated. And I would write cover letters for each application that I did, and I would change very minor things. So like for that one, it was highlighting all the marketing stuff that I had done it previously, and what technologies I used, and what I know now. Um, for another company, they were like a financial one. So I talked a little bit up more about what I did with the producer and my final project. So I constantly was talking with him, um, trying to figure out how to sort of sell and pitch my story of where I was, where I am now, and just kind of guiding, having him guide me, because he was a recruiter, so he kind of knew what they were looking for. He knew
that's cool.
how they interact with people and all that kind of thing. So really leveraging how he understood things. This just happened to be that one way that it actually ended up working out. But definitely, even after that, um, I got the offer and I sent it to him, and he actually read it over, to make sure that there wasn't anything that completely stood out or anything like
That's
that.
nice.
So
That's a great resource.
yeah,
Yeah.
very much. We are seen as, not just students, right, but people who are looking for jobs, people who are trying to learn new skills. um, they have job postings that they get, and so they send it out to all the alumni and say, hey, if you have this experience and you're looking for a new thing, contact me. So continually being engaged and having that dialogue with them has really helped, not only now, but it's going to help in the future as well, in terms of when if I'm done with Gritty and where I want to go, or if the opportunity presents itself.
So I like that you mentioned that you work in React every day, and that's something that you learned at LearningFuze, but you've still been learning new technologies on the job. So since you've been in this role for about a year now, like how have you grown as a developer over the last year
Yeah.
since you took the job?
So there are so many opinions by so many different developers out there. So it's really, really interesting, having been working as a developer now. Um, you start to learn about and understand different types of, whether it's functional programming or looking at React specifically, how much functionality do you want the actual React app to have? Should all the calculations be done on the back end and you're just displaying information? If we have a component, do we want it to be a smart component or a dumb component? Because we can just send a bunch of props into it based on the context of what we're looking at, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to build a button and it's going to be just this one button. Or we can build it more dynamically and then be able to reuse those assets over and over again. I fully admit that I was building one very specific thing for each page, going through the program, because that's just sort of how I need to make this one page look good. Like, let's just make this one page look good. And then being in a development role with a lot of other people who have opinions and more experience than I do, quite frankly, they have sort of opened my eyes to how you can create a better experience, not only for a user, but also for the developers who are working in that arena, just by creating standards and sticking to those, and making sure that, everyone who, we're constantly checking each other's code and approving it before it gets sent out for release, that you start to really understand how other people's thought processes are, as well as how you can ultimately become sort of one group that's building a thing, as opposed to just an individual person who's like, I have the idea, I have the technical expertise, and um, I'm doing this on the side, or something like that, right?
Yeah, it sounds like you can like really see the big picture. And as I talk to folks that graduate from boot camps and go into their second and third jobs and really get like a lot of experience after they graduate, I hear the same thing over and over again, which is like, when you graduate from a boot camp, you can figure out a way to do something, but as you get that experience and time, you see all the ways to do things, and the right way to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which can only come with experience. So
Right. We've been hiring recently at Gritty, and I think it's 4 of the last 5 people that we hired all came from various boot camps.
amazing.
So one from Dev Mountain out of Utah, one from General Assembly. He was in Washington, D.C. doing that.
Cool.
Another one, I can't remember what his was called, but yeah, the senior engineer, he self-taught. So
That's really cool to hear.
I think like that sort of being around those people too has really sort of helped, like, hey, like, you're not the only one who's gone through, this huge change and everything as well.
That's awesome. Well, I think that is a beautiful place to end. So, John, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you.
Your final project turned out really cool. Uh, and also, I think just throughout this, you've been peppering in such great advice to future boot campers. So we will definitely transcribe this, and we'll point out where you gave really great takeaways.
Yeah,
But yeah, this has been wonderful, and congratulations on your new job.
thank you.
Uh, Yay! And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Let us know in the comments which school you would like to see a final project walkthrough from next. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.